Hey, you guys. This is a rather late live, but I asked Mister if I could do it late, and he said it was fine. And so earlier today, I did a live with Cynthia G. And during that live, I read an excerpt of a journal called the Journal of the History of Sexuality. And the topic was the sexual abuse of Black men under American slavery. And I read a passage from this book, which I'm about to read now. And that passage prompted me to read the account of the slave that was quoted in the book named Lewis Clark. So we're going to be doing two things here. We're going to be reading the small excerpt from this book about a rape of a free woman by a Black slave, and essentially also the rape of that Black male slave. And then we're going to go and we're going to read this account of Lewis Clark. So Lewis Clark was a slave. But what's interesting about his account is, number one, it's not a sentence or two. It's very long. He actually gave, I don't want to call it a lecture because he was a slave, but he had the opportunity, if you can call it that, to speak to a room of white people candidly about slavery. And what is fascinating about Lewis Clark is that he didn't talk about the physical aspects of slavery. He didn't talk about the rape. He didn't talk about the chains. He didn't talk about the beatings. He did something that I really have never seen in all of my research. He talked about the mental and emotional strain and trauma that slavery caused. And he discusses a lot of issues that we talk about now. He discusses the mulatto class. He discusses archetypes of Black people being, thieves and things like that. So he actually talks about a lot of the same things we talk about today. But the interesting thing is he's talking about them as an actual slave. And so anyway, I definitely want to get to that, but I want to start with the document that led me to wanting to read the Lewis Clark narrative. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and all of the links to what I'm reading. Well, the journal, you'll have to purchase it, but the link to the narrative that I'm going to be reading by this slave is held by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so it's in the description box if you guys decide that you want to use it for teaching your little ones, or you want to reference back to it. So, all right. So I'm going to start with this excerpt from this journal, and it's titled "The Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under American Slavery," and it's by Thomas A. Foster. So in 1787, an enslaved man in Maryland raped a free Black woman. The story comes to us from the female victim in the incident, Elizabeth Amwood. One white man, William Holland, had her pull up her clothes and lie down. He then called a Negro manslave, so this is a free woman and an enslaved Black man, and ordered him to pull down his breeches and get upon the said Amwood, and to be great with her. So he was told to be great with her, have sex with her. A fourth individual in this horrific scene, a white man named John Pettigrew, operating with Holland, pointed a pistol at the unnamed enslaved man and Elizabeth Amwood. All the while, Holland taunted them both, asking if it was in, meaning is his penis inside of her, and if it was sweet. You know, he was asking the Black man if the Black woman's vagina was sweet. Afterward, William went up into the company and called for water to wash his hands, saying he had been putting a mare to a horse. To understand what that means is, I don't know if you guys have ever seen the mating of horses, but they literally take the horse's penis and they grab it and they put it inside of the female horse. So after they forced this black man, and essentially they were raping this black man too, right? Even though they were forcing him to rape that free black woman, it was rape for him too. One of the white men, William, had to go wash his hand because he had physically taken the black man's penis and he put a mare to a horse, meaning he took the black man's penis and he put it inside of the black woman. And then by gunpoint, he had the black man rape that free black woman. And this was a free black woman being raped by a slave. So, and again, this is a true historical account, all right? This is in a journal. Specifically, it's in the Journal of the History of Sexuality under Intersections of Race and Sexuality. So this is not fictional, what I'm reading, and I think I just want to impress that upon you because I know it's quite shocking. So it goes on to say, scholars have suggested that rape can serve as a metaphor for enslavement, thus applying to both men and women who were enslaved. As Aliyah Abdur Rahman argues, the vulnerability of all enslaved Black persons to nearly every conceivable violation produced a collective raped subjectivity. The standard scholarly interpretation of how slavery affected Black manhood is perhaps best captured by the comments of one former slave, Lewis Clark, who declared that a slave can't be a man. And it's going to be this account by this slave, Lewis Clark, that I want to go over with you guys today. I'm going to read this entire account, his words as he speaks about slavery. And mind you, he was a slave at this time. So this is from around 1802. So this man was a slave and he is speaking on slavery. And I'm going to start where he starts talking. So above here, it's white people because he was put in a room full of white people and given carte blanche to speak freely about slavery at an anti-slavery standard conference. And so I want to just go over what he said. This slave that quoted and said that a man cannot be a man. A slave cannot be a man. Because everything he said was so profound. Hi, everybody. So I'm reading what he said, and every once in a while I'm just going to stop so that we can just discuss specifically what's being said here. So I will, as well as I can, I want to tell you not so much about the slaves being whipped or about his not having enough to eat. Remember, we're listening to a slave talk. Though I could tell you enough of that too, if I had a chance. But what I want to make sure you understand is that a slave can't be a man. Slavery makes a brute of a man. I don't mean that he is a brute neither, but a horse can't speak, and he daren't. He daren't tell what's in him. It wouldn't do. The worse he's treated, the more he must smile. The more he's kicked, the lower he must crawl. He's talking about a mentality of men who are slaves. I was so interested when I was doing the series with Sin, why none of the men talked about how they felt being helpless, like the man we just read about, who was forced to rape a Black woman while a white man grabbed his penis and shoved it inside of a free Black woman. And at gunpoint, he was forced to have sex with her. No male slaves that I could find would talk about what that was like. This male slave, he's talking about what it's like. And he's speaking to a mentality of submissiveness. He said the worse that he's treated, the more he must smile. The more he's kicked, the lower he must crawl. For you see, the master knows. He's talking about a battle between men. The master knows when he's treated his slave too bad for human nature, and he suspects the slave will resent, and he watches him all the closer. So he said the worse that the slave man was treated, the closer the slave master's eye would be on him, because he would expect that that slave would have resentment. And so then he's got to keep an eye on him, right? Because at the end of the day, these slaves are men. And so the slave has to become more deceitful. Folks from hereabouts go down to Kentucky, and they send you word that the slaves, they don't want their freedom. How many times have you guys seen that in a slave movie? That a slave will say, you know, Massa treats us so well. You know, we're not going to run from here. Massa's a good Massa. He's not like Massa over there. I've seen this many times in slave movies. I've seen this portrayed many times in white-funded slave movies. And here we have a slave who's speaking to that narrative. He said, and they send you word that the slaves say they don't want their freedom. Well, I suppose they do. I daren't swear I had done that thing myself. I had the privilege of letting myself out and sending my master $12 a month. This was sort of a taste of freedom, for I went round about and made my own little contracts and so on. Now, if some Yankee had come along and said, "Do you want to be free?" what do you suppose I would have told him? Now, what do you suppose I'd tell him? Why, I'd tell him, sure, that I didn't want to be free and that I was well off. And if I didn't, it's precious few more contracts I should be allowed to make, I'm thinking. And if a woman slave had a husband and children and somebody asked her if she liked her freedom, would she tell him yes? If she had, she'd been down the river to Louisiana in no time, and her husband and children never know what become of her. Of course, the slaves don't tell folks what's passing in their minds about freedom. So he's saying that slaves did used to say that they didn't want their freedom. They did used to say, Massa's a good massa and I don't want to go. But he said it's because slaves wouldn't tell white people what is in their minds about freedom, for they know what will come of it if they do. I said a slave was like a brute, and so he is in many things, but he ain't altogether that much like a brute neither. The fact is, slavery's the father of lies. I am so blown away that this is a slave that said this. He said the fact is, slavery's the father of lies. We see these accounts of slaves saying, I have a good massa, I don't want to be free. No, I don't want to be free, massa. And here we have a slave that spoke in the 1800s, 1802. And he said, it's not that they don't want to be free. They just know what will come of saying that out loud. He said, the fact is, slavery's the father of lies. Why am I reading this? Because I want us to think, because he's speaking to the mentality of a slave, how a slave thinks. And I want us to compare that to some of our thought process now. The slave knows he ought to have his freedom. Do we know that we ought to have our liberation? We do. He said the slave knows that he ought to have his freedom, and his master knows it. I would say that's the truth for today too. We know that we ought to have socio-political revolution, and the wealthy and the elite know that we ought to have socio-political revolution. Just like This slave is saying. The slave knows he ought to have his freedom, and his master knows it just as well as he does, but they both say they don't. And they tell me some folks this way believe them. Everybody knows the truth, but everybody denies it. That's what he's saying. As a slave, that's what he's saying. The slaves know and the master knows that the slave wants his freedom and the master knows he ought to free him. But everybody pretends like that's not the case. We do that with socio-political revolution. Everybody knows we need to have one, but everybody keeps acting like that's not the case. The master says the slave don't want his freedom, and the slave says he don't want it. But both of them lie and know it. There was never anything beat slavery for lying. And of all folks in the world, there's nobody deceived quite so bad as the masters down south, for the slaves deceive them away. And they deceive themselves. He said the slaves deceive the masters, and the slaves deceive themselves with regard to freedom. This is so deep, y'all. It just gets deeper the longer I read it. Like he's just gonna be, I mean, this man is a slave. He said the slaves deceive themselves and they deceive the masters with regard to freedom. Some have thought their slaves were so much attached to them that nobody could coax them away. We've seen that portrayed in slave movies too, haven't we? Isn't it crazy how a commentary from a slave from 1802 sounds like every antebellum slave movie we've ever seen? Some masters have thought their slaves were so much attached to them that nobody could coax them away, and very few slaves now reside in Canada. Others think the slaves are too brutified to think or care anything about freedom. I feel that, I'm not going to lie, I feel that way sometimes about our people. I feel like our people have been too brutified. They've been too beaten into submission to care about socio-political revolution. Like they're just not going to do it. And them's the worst deceived of any. Look what he says. And them's the worst deceived of any. The masters say the slaves are a lying, thieving set. How many times have we heard the archetype of Black people that we are liars and thieves? Liars and thieves. Will it surprise you that this slave, he doesn't deny that we are liars and thieves? Listen to him. He says the masters say that slaves are a lying and thieving set. And so they are. He says slaves are lying and thieving. We are lying and thieving. This is a slave talking. He says the masters think we're liars and thieves, and we are liars and thieves. He said, for slavery makes a man lie and steal. It won't let him be honest if he would. That is the realest thing I have ever heard. The masters called the slaves liars and thieves, and he said we are liars and thieves because slavery makes you have to lie. Slavery makes you have to steal. Slavery doesn't allow you to be honest. He said, slavery makes a man lie and steal. It won't let him be honest if he would. I'm telling you guys, you don't know how happy I was to find this. To find this account from a slave, because it is so rare that I get to read an account from a slave that simply talks about the psychological aspects of slavery on him as a man. His introspection is so profound to me. This is literally one of the most profound documents I have ever read. Some folks go down to Kentucky. Now he's about to talk about the house slave and the field slave. He's about to talk about those high yellow slaves that got to live in rich people's houses and wear fine clothes. You know how we always thought, because slave movies taught us that there was a division between the house slaves and the field slaves. Slave movies always taught us that the house slaves were better off than the field slaves, where this slave is about to say that that's all a lie. Listen to what he says about the slaves that get to live in the big house. He said, some folks go down to Kentucky and tell fine stories about how well the slaves live, that they dress as nice as anybody and have a horse to ride a Sunday. Well, so it is with many of them, slaves that are the favorites of rich families. He says there are slaves that get to wear fine clothes. They even get their own horse to drive on Sundays. They get to live with the rich families. But listen to what he says about those slaves, you guys. And I guarantee you, because I've never heard this until I read this slave's account of slavery. He says, but I tell you, them favorite slaves are the most to be pitied of all. He said the favorite slaves of the whites, the ones that lived in the house with the whites, we should have the most pity for them. Have you guys ever heard that? Have you guys ever heard that the house slaves should be pitied more than the field slaves? I've never heard this until I read this slave's account. Listen to why he says. He says they are obliged to cringe a little lower than any of the others. They must mind and please the master and mistress in everything, and please the children, and the uncles, and the aunts, and the cousins, and all the relations. For the master wants him to feel it is all along of his will that he is better off than the others, and that he has the power at any moment to cut his comb. And he is always sort of jealous too, that the slave will think he has a right to any of the privileges he has been used to having. Y'all, who has ever heard this said about a house slave? That the house slaves should be pitied more than the field slaves because their proximity to whiteness means that they have to crawl on their belly a little lower. They have to worry about being so close to whites that they have to please every white person around. The master, the mistress, the children, the uncles, the aunts, the cousins, the family, everybody. They have to try to make them all happy. And all the while, the master is harder on them because he never wants the slave to feel entitled, like he deserves to be there. I've never heard that said of house slaves. I never thought of it that way. When I told Mr. this, he said it's the same way today. He said those token blacks that get the token positions at companies, they have to mind their blackness even closer because everybody around them is white. He said, nothing has changed today. That's what Mr. told me. And I never thought about it that way. But to hear a slave say, because that's not how history has spun it. That's not what our conditioning has taught us. We have always been taught that the house slaves were haughty. Have we not? We've always been taught that the house slaves were preferred and saw themselves better. But here we have a slave saying that they are the ones we should pity the most, because they had to grovel lower than anybody. They were always in danger because they could not displease any white person they were around. There was no escape or respite for them. I've never heard that before. You see how different the narrative about our history is when a white person makes a movie or a history book tells us versus when we read the account of a slave from their own mouth? I was blown away when I read that, but he blows me away more because he talks about so much. So he's talking about, again, these house slaves. He said, so he has to mind his P's and Q's right smart. For if he says or does anything that any of the relations don't like, he is pushed right down below all the slaves. Meaning, And I actually have another book written by a slave in my house. And she says the same thing, that she was a house slave and they would threaten her with the threat of being made the lowest slave on the plantation. Like, you think you're too good? We'll make you the lowest of the low. We'll put you beneath the lowest field slave. And this is exactly what this slave is saying too, that they had to mind their P's and Q's, because if they did anything to offend the master, they were going to be made the biggest example. He says, I've seen this many a time. The brighter a slave is, the more he has to lie. Now he's talking about intelligence, because white people thought that the slaves were stupid. But he's about to say that the slaves pretended to be stupid, because the smarter you were, the dumber you had to act. Listen to what he says. He said, the brighter a slave is, the more he has to lie. For the master is jealous of what's working in his mind, and the harder he has to hide it. It ain't the lightest colored that are always the brightest and the best, for a man's disposition ain't his skin. Listen to what he's saying. See, if you guys have heard me read from that medical journal where a white doctor talks about W.E.D. Du Bois, and they also they say that it's the lighter skinned slaves. This is also in Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a fictional book. But remember, a white woman wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in Uncle Tom's Cabin, the brightest of slaves was a mixed slave, right? A light skinned slave. And in the narrative that was written by that white doctor, that historical document that I often reference on this channel, he too elevated the high yellow slaves, the high yellow blacks, saying that they had more intellectual prowess because they were part white. But listen to what this slave says. He said the brighter a slave is, the more he has to lie. He means brighter by smart. But he goes on to say that a man's disposition ain't in his skin, that it's not the high yellow slaves that were the smartest. Listen to what he says. He said, it ain't the lightest colored that are always the brightest and best, for a man's disposition ain't his skin. Yes, it is in his skin too, because it is in his heart. His heart is inside of his skin. But what I mean is, it ain't the color of his skin. Now listen to what he says about what the slaves used to fight about. He said the slaves used to debate together sometimes. What could be the reason that yellow folks couldn't be trusted like the dark ones could? Oh, is he talking about a narrative? Is he talking about a narrative right now? He's talking about how the slaves wondered to themselves why a mixed slave, a high yellow slave, could not be trusted in the same way that you could trust a dark-skinned slave. He says, as a general rule, they seem to be dissipated, devil-may-care fellows. And I'll tell you what we concluded was the reason. We concluded it was because they were the sons of their masters and took after their fathers. He's saying back in the day, they recognized that the high yellow slaves, the part white slaves, were the most dangerous and the most wicked. And that they came to the conclusion it's because they took after the white fathers that had raped the women to create them. We concluded it was because they were the sons of their masters and took after their fathers. You laugh, but that's what slaves concluded was the reason. And I declare I felt ashamed of the white blood that was in me, because he is an admixed slave. He said it made him feel ashamed to be mixed, because the truth was that's what they observed about the light-skinned slaves. Listen to what he says. And I tell you that a man bears the best character. He said, and I tell you, the man that bears the best character in all Kentucky in respect of his morals has a face as black as the inside of a blackening box. He's saying it's the darkest, deepest black ones that tend to have the best moral character. He says he is engaged in the public works and takes hundreds of dollars. He might run away with the money if he would, but ever since he was a boy, he has walked right ahead, as straight as any crack in this floor. You might ask anybody from the highest to the lowest, and they'd all tell you that they trust him before any man in Kentucky. White men trust one another, I know, but mind ye, they always have a bond and security. Now, it would be no use for this man to give a bond and security, for he is a slave. He said these white people act like they trust each other, but they don't trust each other because they use bonds and securities. They won't even trust each other in business, but they would give these deep, dark, black slaves money without any bond and security because they knew they could be trusted. They didn't worry about where their money would go. They didn't worry about what would happen. He said it was the deepest and the blackest of them that were the most moral. He goes on, and an audience member, because remember, this is a slave talking to a room full of white people. And one of the audience members interrupts and said, I thought you observed a little while ago that slaves couldn't be honest and that they were obliged to lie and steal. And so his response, right, because they're calling him a liar in the nicest possible way, his response is, so I did, and it was true. But this man, you see, was a slave. And then again, he wasn't a slave. He was a first-rate blacksmith and worked for the public works and had money trusted to him. And this made him feel somehow like a man, though he was a slave too. They trusted him a good deal, you see. And so another white person interrupts him and says, you mean that if you trust a man, it makes him worthy to be trusted? And he didn't quite understand what they were saying, so they reiterated themselves and asked him if he meant that if a slave feels he is trusted, he may be trusted with anything. And he said, not exactly that neither. When a slave knows that he is trusted, he may be trusted with almost anything except himself. Isn't that interesting? When a slave knows that whites trust him, he can be trusted with anything but himself. Is that not the true today? Is that not true today? Black people can be trusted with anything but each other. We can't be trusted with blacks. Our problem is us. But a white person, oh, we won't cross them. I mean, I know some people will, but I'm speaking overall, right? And the white people thought that was funny. It says that they laughed. And when they finished laughing at what he said, he continued talking. And he said, but the smarter he is, and I want to stress that this is a real slave. We're reading the words of an actual slave. This is not a book. This is not fictitious. This is a real slave that is speaking. He said, but the smarter he is, the more they jealous him, and the more they like to hold him for a slave. Isn't that the same today? The more blacks look to advance themselves, the more society wants to hold them down. Remember that historical document that I like to read, written by the medical doctor, where he said if 1 in every 10 blacks had the intellect of Du Bois, that whites and blacks could no longer coexist. He said that our people would suffer the same fates as the natives of this country, meaning they would start to kill us. And this slave is saying the same thing that white man said in that medical journal. He's saying the smarter he is, the more they jealous him, the more they like to hold him for a slave. And the whiter he is, the grander they feel. As a general thing, if a Kentuckian has a little money, he'd rather vest it in slaves than in any other property. A horse don't know that he is property, and a man does. There's a sort of satisfaction in thinking you're a man, but you're mine. He's saying that part of the pleasure that white people had in owning slaves is because when you own something like a horse, when you own an animal, the horse doesn't know that you own them. But deep down, even though white people said that they weren't people, they weren't human, he's saying whites know that they're human and that they took a pleasure in knowing that they owned another man. He's speaking specifically about slavery from a man's point of view. What it is like for one man to feel that he has control over another man, that they took pleasure in the subjugation of another man. Remember, we read earlier about the slave that was forced to rape the free woman and how the white man took the slave's penis and shoved it inside of that black free woman. That's a real account. He's saying that he took pleasure in doing that. It was pleasurable for him to take a fully grown man's penis and force him to rape a woman. He washed his hand afterward and said that he put a mare to a horse. He mated them like he would an animal. That's a real account. We read it earlier. That's something that really happened. And this slave is seconding that mindset. He's saying they took pleasure in it because they knew that they had broken another man. They knew that they had dominated another man. They knew that they were owning another man, and they took pleasure in it. Again, this is slavery from a slave male's perspective, talking about the dynamic between men. I feel like this is a voice we don't get to hear often. We don't get to hear slave men talking about what it was like to be a man in this position. Women are always submissive. Even if we act out, a man could easily put us down on the ground. It's a different thing for a man to dominate another man. And here this slave is talking very freely about what that is like from a male perspective. I have never read anything like this, you guys. I had to share this with you guys because it is just, this is so profound. And again, I made sure I put the sources in the description box if you guys want to have them for yourself and read through this yourself. He said, a horse don't know he's property and a man does. There's a sort of satisfaction in thinking you're a man, but you're mine. You're as white as I am, but you're mine. He's talking about the high yellow slaves, that they took a pleasure, especially in enslaving the high yellow ones, because you might look white, but you're still a slave. Many a time I've had him say to me, you're my property. If I tell you to hold your hand in the fire till it burns, you've got to do it. That's crazy, right? Can you imagine? We can, right? Because right now, we know that there's a group of men that dominate our men. But can you imagine being a male slave? He said that he's been told that you're my property. If I tell you to put your hand in fire, you better do it. And he can't say anything back. He said, not that they meant to make me put my hand in the fire, but they liked to let me know they had the power. They liked to make the threat so that I wouldn't forget that they had the power over me to do what they wanted with me. That's crazy. The whiter a man is, the lower down they keep him. I knew a slave that was all white. I might tell you his name and where he lived. I believe I will. No, I won't. For if I do, you may perhaps ask me whether I came from this neighborhood, and I don't care to have you know any more of me than that I came from Kentucky. So he's obviously a runaway slave, and he doesn't trust these white people. Like, they might have him in a room full of white people talking about they want to help slaves, but he doesn't trust them. So he doesn't want to give any names because he doesn't want them sending him back into slavery. That is crazy. I mean, I can't with this document. I cannot. He says, but what I want to say was that this slave was white, stolen from Virginia when he was a little boy, and he had been kept in slavery ever since. He was brought up more ignorant than any of the slaves, and if a whipping was to be done on the plantation, he was sure to catch it. The slaves used to say to him, Massa had a great deal rather whip you than Steve. Now, Steve was the blackest man of the whole lot. Knowing he was a white man, I suppose they were afraid he'd find out his rights if they didn't keep down on him right hard. So he said the high yellow, basically white one, was getting beat more than the blackest of the black because they needed to make sure he knew his place. And then look what he says about Kentucky. After he says all that, he says Kentucky is the best of the slave states in respect to laws. But the masters managed to fix things pretty much to their own liking. The law don't allow them to brand a slave or cut off his ear. Because, you know, in some states, they could both brand them like you would a cow, and they could cut off their body parts. But he said in Kentucky that was against the law. But if they happen to switch it off with cowhide, nobody says anything about it. If they took a whip and whipped off the ear of a man, nobody would say anything about it. Though the laws are better than in other states, they ain't always equal. If a Negro breaks open a house, he is hung for it. But if a white man does the same thing, he's put in the penitentiary, unless he has the money to buy himself off. And there is one crime for which black men are hung. There's one crime for which more black men are hung than any other. And if a white man does it, it is no crime at all. The law gives him full swing, and he don't fail to use his privilege, I can tell you. Now, if there was nothing else, it would make a slave's life as bad as death many times. I can't tell these respectable people as much as I would like to, but just think for a minute how you would like to have your sisters or your wives or your daughters completely, totally, and altogether in the power of a master. He's reaching into something that I think I've personally never heard. He's talking about how would you feel as a man if your wife, if your sister, if your daughter were in complete power of another man? Can we talk about it? He's talking about the psychological trauma of slavery on black men. How do you think it makes you feel to know you can't actually protect them? I wonder if some of our men feel that today. Just feel, you know, this, we have prisons, we have police. He said, would you feel to know that at any time someone can violate these women? This is the first time he's talked about slave women. He said, how would you feel as a man if your sister, if your wife, if your daughters could be completely violated by another man at any time and you could do nothing about it? He said, you can picture yourselves a little how you would feel, but oh, if I can tell you, a slave woman ain't allowed to respect herself if she would. I had a pretty sister. She was whiter than I, for she took more after her father. When she was 16 years old, her master sent for her. When he sent for her again, she cried and didn't want to go. She told her mother her troubles. She tried to encourage her to be decent and hold up her head, wear above such things if she could. Her master was so mad to think she complained to her mother that he sold her right off to Louisiana, and we afterward heard that she died there of hard usage. He goes on. There was a widower in Kentucky who took one of his women slaves into the house. She told her master one day that seven of the young girls had poked fun at her for the way she was living. This raised ambition. I'll teach him to make fun, he said. So he sent the woman away and ordered the young girls to come up to him one by one. Perhaps I better not try to tell this story, he continued, for I cannot tell it as it was, though surely it is more shameful to have such a thing done than to tell of them. He got mad with the girls because they complained to their mother, but he didn't like to punish them further for fear it would make them talk. He raped 7 little girls. He raped 7 little girls. And then he ordered them to go out to the field and do work that was too hard for them. 6 of them said they couldn't, but the mother of the 7th, guessing what it was for, told her to go and do the best she could. The other 6, every one of them was tied up naked and flogged for disobeying orders. Now, who would like to be a slave, even if there was nothing bad about it, but such treatment of his sisters and daughters? He's saying, what man wants to be in that position? But there's a worse thing yet about slavery. Thing in the whole lot, though it's all bad, from the butt end to the pint. I mean the patter rollers or patrols. I suppose you know that they have patter rollers to go around o' nights to see that the slaves are all in and not planning any mischief. Now these are just about the worst fellows that can be found, as bad as any you could pick up at the wharves. The reason is, you see, that no decent man will undertake this business. Gentlemen in Kentucky are ready enough to hire such jobs done. But if I was to ask any of them to be a patter roller, he would look upon it as a right down insult, and likely enough would blow out your brains for an answer. They're mighty handled with pistols down there, and if a man doesn't resent anything that's put upon him, they call him a poke easy. The slaves catch it too, and them as won't fight, it's called a poke easy. But as I was telling ye, they hire these patty rollers, and they have to take the meanest fellows above ground, because they are so mortal to the slaves. Because they are so mortal, sure, the slaves don't want their freedom. They have to put all powers in their hand to do with the niggers as they like. If a slave don't open his door to them at night, they break it down. They steal his money if they can find it, and they act just as they please with their wives or daughters. He's saying that these patty rollers would come in the middle of the night, and if you didn't let them in your hut willingly, they would break the door down. They would take any money, because sometimes slaves were allowed to keep money, and then they would rape the wives and the daughters that were in the hut. Now listen to what he says happens to the men if they try to defend the women. And I just want to think about, like, do you think that this propensity to not be able to defend our women, that there's some residue of that left? This feeling that they should not be defended, this feeling that you cannot defend them, that so many of our men have. It's just a thought. But he says, if a husband dares to say a word or even look as if he wasn't quite satisfied. So if the man decides he even looks like he isn't happy if her daughter is being raped, they tie him up and give him 39 lashes. If there's any likely young girls in a slave's hut, they're mighty apt to have business there, meaning that they sought out huts that had young girls in them, especially if they think any colored man takes a fancy of them. So he's saying if they thought there were young girls in a hut, they would make a special stop there to rape the girls. And if they knew that a slave wanted a woman, they would make sure that they would rape her. The violation of the women was an attack on the men. They would violate the women to attack the men. Now, I know a lot of people don't like Cynthia G, but she said something, and it is true. She said, what Black men are failing to realize is that if you let them hurt your women, it is a reflection on you. And isn't it crazy that we are reading in a slave narrative that they would intentionally target the women just to prove a point to the men? This is crazy, y'all. I'm sorry, this document is so crazy. It's so flippin' deep. It's so deep. He said maybe he'll get a pass from his master to go up and see a young girl for a few hours. The patty rollers break in and find him there. They abuse the girl as bad as they can, a purpose to provoke him. They abuse the women to get at the men. They are saying you cannot protect your women. When I hear Black men say that Black women do not deserve protection, this is what I will think of. I will think of hundreds of years of Black men being put in positions where they were conditioned to believe you cannot protect these women, where they intentionally would violate women to prove a point about the weakness of the man. This is a slave talking. How many of these behaviors have we carried on? This is a slave man. I mean, I'm not even trying to be funny right now. This is a slave man talking about what it is like, the mind fuck that it was to be a man in this position. He said if he looks cross, then they give him a flogging and tear up his pass and turn him out of the doors. And then they take him up and whip him for being without a pass. If the slave says they tore it up, they swear he lies. Does this sound like the police? Y'all, does this sound like the police? He said if you dare to try to protect the woman, they will set you up. Because, you know, the slave would have to have a pass to go visit the woman. They would tear up the slave's pass, beat him for not having a pass, and then if the slave tried to say this is a setup, they'll call him a liar. Does this sound like planting of drugs? Does this sound like Black men going to jail for things they didn't do? If you dare to act protective of your women, we'll set you up. We're going to say you're lying. Prove it. Prove I set you up. He said, and 9 times out of 10, the master won't come at them. For they say it don't do to let the niggers suppose they may complain of the patty rollers. To keep the hierarchy, it doesn't even matter that they're lying. They don't want these Black people to think that they're above the law. He says, oh, how often I've seen the poor girls sob and cry when there have been such going on. Maybe you think because they're slaves, they ain't got no feeling and no shame. A woman's being a slave don't stop her from having genteel ideas. That is according to their way, and as far as they can. They know they must submit to their masters. Besides, their masters maybe dress them up and make them little presents and give them more privileges. So a lot of times we hear on Black YouTube, Black men saying, well, Black slave women liked it. But you hear this saying that they didn't like it. And besides the fact that masters would dress them up, that they would give them presents and all that, he said, but that ain't like having a parcel of low, dirty, swearing, drunk patty rollers let loose among them like so many hogs. He said it would break their dread and make them wish they were dead. He said, now who among you would like to have your wives and daughters and sisters in such a situation? This is what every slave in all of these states is exposed to. Yet folks go to these parts down in Kentucky and come back and say the slaves have enough to eat and drink and that they are happy. How many times have we heard white people spin this narrative that the slaves were well treated and well fed? Well, this slave says they might have been well fed, but they were still getting raped in the night. They were still getting beaten, and the men were still defenseless to protect their women. But isn't that the new narrative that a lot of conservatives try to push? Well, most slaves are well treated. Slaves are valuable. They weren't treated badly. Define treated badly. You think because somebody's stomach is full, that negates the rest of it? But that's definitely a narrative I've heard being pushed around in 2018, 2019. I have definitely heard white people who don't want to be ashamed of the history of their people say that. He then goes on to talk about that they are proud about punishing in public. They enjoy degrading men in public. If a man ties up his slave in the marketplace and flogs him till he can't stand, the neighbors will cry out, "What a shame! The man has no regard to his character. What an abominable thing to have that nigger screaming where everybody has to hear. Shame on him to do such things in public." But if the same slave 10 times as hard up a garret or down a cellar with his mouth stopped, then he may make noise or off in the woods of hearing that it's all well enough. So he said, you guys are hypocrites. You really just don't like to see the nasty part of slavery. But as long as they're hurting us in their cellar or where you don't have to be bothered with it, it's okay. He goes on to say, this is the cruelty of things. A slave can't be a man. A slave can't be a man. He must be a brute. But he ain't a brute neither. If he had the chance to act himself out, many a one of them is right smart, I tell you. But a horse can't speak, and a slave daren't. And that's the best way I can tell the story. So that was the first day of him speaking to the white audience. I'm going to go ahead and read the second day. But he said a slave can't be a man. My question is to the men, and I'm not trying to pick on you, you guys. It's just that this is a slave man talking. My question is, can you be a man in this society in the fullest way? Was it Neely Fuller Jr. I heard say that Essentially, you're a man until the police come to your house, and then they're the man. I think it was Neely Fuller Jr. that said that. He said, "You're a man until the police come to your house, and then they're the man." Let's go on to the second part of this commentary. Okay, so this is from October 27th, 842. This is the second day of his commentary to this white audience. He said, "It is true that slaves now and then fare exceedingly well indeed, so far as eating and drinking, and the like goes. And sometimes for a while they have learned nothing to do. I had a young master at one part of my life that give us an easy time. His father, and he ran through it as fast as he could. He got drunk every day. We lived on the fat of the land while it lasted. He got drunk every day. We lived on the fat of the land while it lasted, and he had a smart chance for doing nothing. But we all see how it must end. And we used to talk about it with heavy hearts sometimes. Then the neighbors, they was all set again us and again him. So when folks there see a man going in difficulty, they make him break up and sell. They like to buy slaves that have had such an easy time, just for the pleasure of bringing their noses to the grindstone. When they see a slave feel a little too much as if he were a man, when they see a slave a little too much as if he were a man, they often double up their fists at him and say, your master makes a fool out of you, but I'll have my satisfaction out of you, you black rascal. They'll take a good deal of pains to get the slaves away from any such free and easy neighbor. I saw, this is kind of like the father whose little girl was being attacked by the police officers, and all he could do was stand there and film, right? All he could do was film. He couldn't really do probably what he wanted to do, which was be a man, which was pull those other men off of his little girl. Because in that moment, his manhood was stolen. In that moment, he was nothing more than a slave, standing by the wayside, while the real men, the people who get to enact their manhood, did what they wanted to with his little girl. So I feel like we see this dynamic often in the present day. We see men's right to be men be trampled on because you're only allowed manhood as far as they will give it to you. Cassandra, I'm not sure what happened to him because he's doing a whole lot of talking. So let's see. Someone in the audience asked if it were common to separate families, because you hear people saying that in slavery time, isn't this a common narrative? The families were stronger because they were kept together, that we were better off as families when we were slaves. That is a common narrative now in 2019. Does everybody agree with that? I've definitely seen that narrative. But listen to what this slave says. He was asked if it was common to separate families. He said, yes, indeed. Why, they mind no more selling children away from a slave than they do calves from a cow. Many and many is the wife that I've seen sobbing and crying for the husband that's driven off to go down the Mississippi. There was one poor woman. Oh, how I did pity that woman. She hadn't seen such hard times as when I knew her. Her first mistress was good to her, and she didn't see much hardship till she was sold. Her husband belonged to my boss, and he would let him go see her sometimes. When the folks was all abed, he'd still often see her for an hour or two and get back in season to make the fires by morning. He didn't leave nothing undone, and a master didn't lose none of his time, but somehow he didn't like to have him go see his wife. He said he might take up with a wife at home if he wanted one. If he found him out, he used to give him a dreadful flogging. Sometimes he'd make me go call him in the middle of the night to find out if he was in. And if he didn't answer, he caught it in the morning. I could tell you, but he would go see his wife. When the master found he couldn't put a stop to it, he sold him. The wife begged him to find somebody round his neighborhood that would buy her. And she kept hoping and hoping, but at last she got discouraged and ran away from him. Her mistress was an awful tyrant. She started her husband right off after her, and for fear somebody would take compassion on the poor woman and buy her, she charged him to bring her home. He goes on to say that the woman was abused. That every day of her life, the mistress was knocking her over the head with tongs or a shovel. This is a white woman. Or press the board or anything that came to hand to set her spinning out into the yard. The ground was covered with coarse gravel, and Betsy had no shoes. Walking backward and forward from morning till night till her feet got all blistered, and the whole of her track was marked with blood. I see that with mine own eyes. She tied rags around her feet, but the blood would come through. And if she dared stop a bit, her mistress would have her switched. Sometimes she just lay on the ground and groaned and screamed, but her mistress would beat her and say, "Oh, you ain't gonna die yet. You was strong enough to run off, so move yourself." She was the most suffering creature that I ever saw. And all that persecution was because she went to see her husband. Separation of families? Yes, indeed. But you will have a narrative spin today. You have the narrative spun today that you have Black people like Jesse Lee Peterson, a whole fucking fool, saying that families were better off in slavery time than they are today. He said separation of families? Yes, indeed. Now he goes to talk about Christians. Somebody asked if the ministers of the Gospels had slaves. And he said a good many of them do, and some treat them full hard as others. I knew a preacher in Kentucky that sent a slave to catch a horse. And because he didn't get back in time for him to go meeting, he tied him up by his hands and left him till he got home. And then he gave him a dreadful flogging. Preacher Raymond didn't used to flog his slaves. He used to duck them. He, a little slave girl about 8 years old, that he used to duck very often. One day the family went to a meeting and left her there to take care of a young child. The child fretted, and she thought she would serve it as master served her, so she ducked it and slipped it out of her hands, and it got drowned. So ducking is when they shove their faces in water and partially drown them. The little girl was only 7, and she had been so badly abused that when she was left alone to babysit one of the master's children. When the child wouldn't behave, she did to that child what the master had been doing to her, which was partially drowning her. Only the little girl dropped the baby, and the baby died. And they sent that 8-year-old little girl to jail. They sent her to prison. And then they killed her, is what he said. He says they took her to the gallows. He says she was so innocent, she didn't know what they were going to do with her. She stopped to pick up a pin and stuck it in her frock as she went. The poor young thing was so glad to get out of prison, as merry as if she was going to her mother's house. But she wasn't going to her mother's house. She was going to the gallows because they killed her. An 8-year-old little girl who was abused. He goes on to say the suffering of the children in slavery will never be the half of it told, especially if the mistress suspects that the child is a little too nearly connected with the master. And then he goes on to talk about abuse of slave children. I'm going to stop reading the document there. He just goes on and on and on. The quote that got me to looking for his commentary that he made was that a slave can't be a man. A slave can't be a man. For hundreds of years, Black men could not be men. For most of the time that our people have been in this country, our men have not been allowed the full freedom of what manhood is. So I just encourage you guys to read the journal on sexual abuse of Black men in slavery. Remember that I opened this up, and we think of sexual abuse of Black men in slavery, we think of Black men being sexually violated directly. But remember that the account that I read was of a Black man having his penis taken in the hands of a white man, and then that white man shoving that Black man's penis into a free Black woman's vagina. And then at gunpoint, he was forced to rape her. A slave can't be a man. So for the men mostly, my question is, can you exercise your full manhood right now? And if something is standing in your way, isn't it time that our men are given the privilege that so many other men in this society have, which is to fully exercise their manhood? Just read through this document yourself. I put the link to this transcript in the chat, and read through this account yourself and just ask yourself, am I capable in this system of fully being a man? I can't answer that question because I'm not a man. Only you guys can. So that's pretty much my life. I'm sorry I wasn't looking at the chat, but yeah, this was an interesting document. For those of you who weren't here for the beginning of this document, I really suggest that you read it. He talked about everything from mulattoes and quadroons and octoroons. He talked about if Black people are really liars and thieves. I mean, that was another really powerful quote from this. He said that white people often say that slaves are lying and thieving, that they're liars and they're thieves. And he said that slaves are liars and thieves. He said the masters say that the slaves are a lying and thieving set, and so they are. For slavery makes a man lie and steal. It won't let him be honest if he would. I mean, this slave said so many profound things that if you missed the beginning of this, you really need to read this document for yourself. He touches on so many of the stereotypes about our people. He talks about what it felt like to be powerless as a man to protect his own women and children. He talks about slavery from the perspective of a man and how it affected him as a man. And he summarizes it by saying that a slave cannot be a man. I would be so interested to hear from men if they feel that they are able to exert the full force of their manhood in today's society, where we have the largest prison population on the planet, and most of the people there are Black men, where police officers terrorize Black neighborhoods, where if you're not a rapper or an athlete, you're almost invisible. So with that said, you guys, I'm gonna go. I know that it's late, but like I said, Mr. gave me permission to do this live, and I just really wanted to do it. It just took me a while to gather my thoughts so that I could be ready to read this, because this was so heavy. And it's the first time I've heard slavery spoken of by a slave in this way. And he debunked a lot of the myths that are now being perpetuated about slavery. But he also dealt with some hard truths. This belief that Black people lie, that we steal, all of those things. And he talks about how while those things may be true, the condition of oppression puts you in a position where if you want it to be great, if you want it to be good, if you want it to be honest, if you want it to not steal, those things are not even options for you. Because you're trying to survive. I'm curious how much of this applies to us today. So with that said, you guys, I will talk to you a little bit later. Please do check out the links in the description box. Take time and read these documents for yourself. Definitely read the sexual abuse of Black men under slavery, because that is interesting, and it's not about, at least in that instance, it wasn't about white men raping Black men. It was about the complete degrading of Black men, even in their forcible rape on Black women, forcing Black men to violate their own women. How much of this baggage, have we carried over? That's really the question we have to ask ourselves. Yeah, RY, The part about the house slave stood out to me too. There's a lot of conditioning that is debunked. If you guys read this, you will find a lot of what whites have taught us about slavery, what movies have taught us about slavery was not true. And it really did. I agree with you, RY. It shed a new perspective on some old narratives. We have to sort of unlearn our conditioning. We all need to do that together. So yeah, I'll talk to you guys later, all right? Good night.